I want you to imagine a scenario, just for a second, that by, every traditional economic metric should trigger just an absolute, unmitigated global meltdown.
Right, a complete free fall.
Exactly. Picture the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it is the single most critical oil choke point on the planet, and right now it is completely closed off.
Yeah, totally gone.
We are currently 6 weeks into this major war involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran. And if you run this reality through, like any standard macroeconomic model, the developing world should just be an absolute free fall right now.
Oh, absolutely. We should be.
Currencies collapsing overnight, right? Mass blackouts shutting down major cities, riots in the streets over the cost of living. But here is the massive plot twist. Surprisingly, it is actually not happening.
Which is, I mean, it's completely counterintuitive if you look at modern economic history. The fundamental rule of the last half century has basically been, you shut down the Gulf, you spike global energy prices, and historically fragile economies just snap. Instantly, yeah. The supply shock creates this massive inflation spiral that developing nations simply cannot, borrow their way out of. But the resilience we are seeing right now on the ground is just defying decades of geopolitical assumptions.
And that is exactly what we are digging into today on this deep dive. We've got this really fascinating piece from April 6th, 2026, a Bloomberg opinion column by Mihir Sharma.
It's a great piece.
It really is. And our mission for today's deep dive is to explore this massive geopolitical irony, really. We're going to look at how the developing nations that gambled heavily on Chinese supply chains are actually surviving this current global energy shock much, much better than those who, place their trust in Pax Americana.
It is a complete inversion of what policymakers and think tanks have been preaching for like the last 10 years.
Yeah.
We have always been told that relying on Beijing is a trap, right? Like a vulnerability just waiting to be exploited. And conversely, that relying on the American-led global security order is the safe, responsible bet.
Right, the gold standard.
Exactly. But right now, today, with the war ongoing and the strait completely blocked, the data on the ground is telling a completely different story.
Okay, so let's move from the theoretical global crisis to a very specific, highly vulnerable case study, just to see exactly why the expected economic collapse hasn't materialized.
Sure.
Let's talk about Pakistan, because if you look at Pakistan's historical vulnerability, it is the classic, dog that didn't bark in this crisis. We are talking about a country sitting on $130 billion in external debt.
Ouch. Yeah.
Yeah, and they have this persistent, grinding current account deficit. Let's pause there for a second, just to clarify for everyone listening. When we say current account deficit in this context, we're talking about a country that consistently imports far more goods and services than it exports, right? Meaning it constantly has to drain its foreign currency reserves, usually US dollars, just to survive.
Yeah, that's precisely the mechanism. Yeah. And for a country like Pakistan, the vast majority of that dollar drain is used to buy imported energy, so oil and liquefied natural gas.
Right.
And much of it is shipped straight through the Strait of Hormuz. So when your entire national grid relies on imported fuel and you barely have the dollars to pay for it on a good day, an energy price shock is basically a death sentence for your economy.
Right, and to give everyone a sense of just how fragile that makes them, think back just a few years to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That energy shock caused a full-scale economic meltdown in Pakistan.
It was devastating.
They were literally making emergency last resort requests for the International Monetary Fund to stave off default. People were dealing with 18-hour power blackouts, just absolute misery. So with the Gulf currently on fire, a nudge, a fraction of this size, should have tipped them right back into that familiar catastrophic spiral.
That was the expectation. I mean, every analyst anticipated a repeat of the 2022 collapse, perhaps even worse, given the direct involvement of the U.S. and Iran.
But that is the plot twist. It is not happening. Now, to be fair, Sharma notes there is stress in the system. It's not a utopia by any means.
Right.
Islamabad has had to hike fuel prices at the pump. There is a sustained shortage of liquid natural gas, which makes it, incredibly hard to keep traditional centralized power plants running.
Yep.
Because of that, they're planning to shut off electricity for 2 to 3 hours a day. But think about that contrast. 2 to 3 hours of planned manageable cuts versus 18-hour catastrophic blackouts where factories literally cannot operate. The country is showing remarkable resilience. So, okay, let's unpack this. How on earth are they keeping the lights on?
Well, the secret weapon here isn't a massive bailout loan from the IMF, and it isn't some, miraculous new offshore oil discovery.
Okay.
It's Chinese-made solar panels.
Seriously?
Seriously. In just the period from 2024 to 2025,
Mm.
Pakistan quietly imported about 17 gigawatts of photovoltaics.
Oh, 17 gigawatts.
Yeah. And to put that staggering number into perspective, they've actually reached a point where a quarter of all households in the country have installed their own solar panels for personal use.
That is wild.
Millions of people have just aggressively transitioned to solar power to basically escape the grid.
Now, hold on, because I have to push back here. That sounds great on paper, but it's like expecting a house of cards to be blown over in a hurricane only to find out someone secretly swapped the cards for bricks,
Right.
How does a country teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, holding $130 billion in external debt, even afford a massive nationwide renewable energy rollout in the first place? That kind of infrastructure transition usually costs, what, hundreds of billions of dollars?
Absolutely.
And beyond that, panels only work when the sun is shining. You can't run a modern economy just during daylight hours. How are they dealing with the nighttime gap without gas power plants?
Those are the exact right questions, and the answer to both is really the brilliance of how this unfolded. First, regarding the cost, Islamabad didn't pay for it.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they didn't manage a massive, expensive, state-led infrastructure rollout like a Western nation might attempt. They basically simply got out of the way. What's fascinating here is that Beijing inadvertently financed the electrification of millions of Pakistani households through its own domestic industrial policy.
Wait, I need you to explain how that works mechanically. Are you saying China just gave them the panels for free out of the goodness of their hearts?
No, not at all. It comes down to Chinese mercantilism, right? Their strategy of heavily subsidizing domestic manufacturing to dominate global trade.
Right.
So over the last few years, Beijing poured billions into subsidizing its own solar factories. The goal was to keep those factories humming, keep their workers employed, and maintain dominance in the green tech sector.
Makes sense.
But they created massive overproduction. They were producing vastly more panels than they could ever use domestically or sell to Western markets, especially, after the West started throwing up tariffs.
Right, the tariff walls.
Exactly. So because of this massive glut in supply, the global price of imported solar panels plummeted by almost 60% in 2024 and 2025.
So Islamabad looks at this absolute flood of dirt-cheap technology pouring out of Chinese factories and makes a very simple policy choice, which is just don't fight it.
Precisely. Instead of fighting it to protect non-existent domestic industries, they just rode the massive Chinese production capacity. They kept tariffs on imported panels extremely low. And to your point about the nighttime gap, it wasn't just panels that flooded the market. It was also cheap Chinese lithium-ion battery storage.
Oh, so they have the batteries.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to this and wondering why your own electricity bill might be spiking while a technically bankrupt nation keeps the lights on, the answer really comes down to trade barriers. Instead of the Pakistani government trying to, secure billion-dollar loans to build giant centralized solar farms, everyday citizens just bought dirt-cheap panels and batteries and threw them on their own roofs.
Yeah. It became a completely decentralized, citizen-driven energy grid. The government didn't have to subsidize the renewables rollout because the Chinese Communist Party essentially already did it for them.
That is just wow.
The citizens took on the microcosts, which were incredibly low, and basically bypassed the failing national grid entirely.
That is wild. And Sharma makes a point to highlight that this isn't just a Pakistan story, and it isn't just about solar panels either. Let's look at Nepal. Nepal currently has a higher proportion of electric vehicles than any other country in the world, except for Norway.
Which, again, sounds completely impossible for a developing, landlocked nation in the Himalayas until you actually look at the mechanics of the supply chain and infrastructure.
Right. They have this huge imported fleet of incredibly cheap Chinese EVs. So right now, while the rest of the world is panicking over gasoline prices because oil tankers can't get through the Strait of Hormuz, Nepal is largely insulated from that chaos. Their cars literally don't need gas.
Exactly.
But transitioning a fleet to electric is notoriously difficult logistically. How is a developing nation generating the massive amount of electricity required to charge all these vehicles without burning coal or gas?
Well, they are using clean electricity coming from a massive, newly developed hydropower infrastructure. And how did Nepal afford to dam their rivers and build those hydro plants? It was financed in large part by Beijing through infrastructure initiatives.
Wow.
So you have a 1-2 punch here. Chinese capital builds the dams to generate the power, and Chinese overcapacity provides the cheap EVs to consume that power. The result is a transportation sector that is practically immune to Middle Eastern oil shocks.
And we are seeing this exact same pattern spreading rapidly far beyond Asia. I mean, Sharma notes there has been a massive sudden spike in imports of Chinese solar panels across sub-Saharan Africa in just the past couple of years. The developing world is essentially building a cheap tech shield against global energy shocks.
They are. They're utilizing the byproduct of China's economic strategy to build local resilience.
I want to stop here because this is where it gets really interesting. If this cheap Chinese tech is such an effective shield against global chaos, why didn't every nation do it? Weren't Western institutions constantly warning these exact countries about the dangers of becoming dependent on China?
Oh, constantly.
It feels like a geopolitical judo move, using your rival's overproduction to solve your own domestic crisis.
It absolutely is a judo move, but it's one that a lot of countries were just too afraid to attempt. You have to remember the prevailing diplomatic narrative over the last decade.
Right.
Western institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and countless think tanks, they've constantly warned developing countries across Asia and Africa about the dangers of becoming deeply intertwined with Beijing.
The famous hegemony trap.
Yes, exactly. The warnings were always about financial risks, debt trap diplomacy, economic pressures, and hidden political costs that might eventually, push their economies toward crisis.
Yeah.
The fear was that if you let China build your grid, China controls your country.
And just to make sure we have our terms clear, the alternative they were pushing was relying on Pax Americana, right?
Right.
The idea that the American-led global order, specifically the U.S. Navy, would always guarantee the safety of global trade routes. The promise was that as long as you played by Western rules, the oil would always flow and the global market would remain stable.
That was the implicit guarantee, yeah.
Yeah.
So many countries made the deliberate strategic choice to block cheap photovoltaic cells from China. They raised tariffs to insulate their own, often less efficient, domestic production. Or they simply wanted to minimize the political risk of being too tied to Beijing.
Makes sense at the time.
Right. They chose slower rates of uptake for green energy because they believed that the open trading order, underpinned by American military hegemony, would protect them from any major supply shocks.
It's like paying a premium for decades for top-tier American flood insurance, only to find out when the hurricane hits, the insurance company is suddenly refusing to pay out. Meanwhile, your neighbor who ignored the warnings and just bought thousands of cheap sandbags from China is sitting completely dry in their living room.
That is a brilliant way to look at it.
Hmm.
Because right now, in April 2026, the logic of the last 10 years has been turned completely on its head.
Why?
The countries that played by the Western rules, that kept Chinese tech out to protect themselves from the hegemony trap, they are currently entirely exposed to the chaos in the Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
They are struggling to secure energy. Meanwhile, the countries that took the supposed risk of relying on Chinese imports and infrastructure are the ones showing this unexpected, remarkable resilience.
It's a total geopolitical flip. If you bet on Beijing's mercantilism, you have electricity and transportation. If you bet on American stability, you are sitting in the dark, paying an absolute fortune for whatever gas you can scramble to find.
It's stark.
Which brings us to the really heavy long-term consequences of this dynamic. We need to look at U.S. foreign policy right now, specifically under the Trump administration, and how this is playing out.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at a potential nightmare scenario for long-term American influence. Think about the signal this current crisis sends to the global South if the Trump administration decides to withdraw from the Gulf without making a serious, sustained, and successful effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. If the U.S. just decides, hey, this isn't our problem anymore, we have domestic energy, we are pulling back from the Middle East.
If that happens, the developing world is going to learn a very harsh, very permanent lesson. The lesson will be, America will make erratic geopolitical decisions that disrupt your vital energy supply. They will take zero responsibility for the massive economic consequences that destroy your economy, and then they will just pack up and leave.
And the flip side of that lesson is obvious, right? China is sitting right there, ready to hand over the exact technology you need to ignore Washington entirely. They will happily sell you the solar panels, the batteries, and the EVs so you can stop caring about whether or not the U.S. Navy is patrolling the Persian Gulf.
It accelerates the decoupling of the global economy, but entirely in reverse of what Washington intended. Instead of the U.S. and its allies successfully decoupling from China's manufacturing base, It's the global south decoupling from the U.S.-led energy paradigm.
You can actually see this disconnect perfectly when you look at how Western markets are reacting to this crisis compared to the geopolitical reality on the ground. I'm looking at the market data right now, mid-crisis, and you'd think a blocked Strait of Hormuz would just tank Wall Street.
Right, you'd assume.
But it hasn't. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is at 46,504, which is down a microscopic 0.13%.
Barely a blip.
Barely a blip. The S&P 500 is actually up 0.11%. The NASDAQ Composite is up 0.18%.
Yeah.
And look at Mexico. The S&P BMV IPC is surging. It's up over 1.5%.
Which tells us something crucial about how the West views its own security. Western markets, and North American markets in particular, are adapting to this shock. They're essentially shrugging off the Gulf chaos, relying on their own booming domestic energy production, or rapidly shifting to different secure supply chains.
Right.
The stock market is surviving the 6-week war just fine, but the stock market is not a measure of global geopolitical influence. While Wall Street is stable, the real tectonic shift is happening in the alignment of the global south.
So what does this all mean for the legacy of current U.S. policy?
Well, Mihir Sharma delivers a pretty devastating final blow in his column. He points out that President Trump may have thought he'd be remembered historically as the leader who restored American greatness by solving long-running, intractable problems. Maybe finally dealing with Venezuela or Cuba or settling the ongoing situation with Iran.
Right.
Instead, because of this specific dynamic, he might actually be remembered in the history books as the president who finally lost Asia to China.
Wow. Because in the moment of ultimate crisis, the U.S. proved to be an unreliable guarantor of security, while China proved to be a reliable vendor of affordable resilience.
Precisely. Now, this raises an important question,
Sure.
and we absolutely have to include a major analytical caveat here.
Okay.
Is betting on Beijing actually safe? Sharma is very clear that while the cheap tech shield is working today, it might turn out to be the catastrophically wrong call in the long run.
Yeah.
It is deeply unwise to imagine that relying on Beijing's goodwill is inherently safer than relying on Washington's security umbrella.
Because, let's be real, China isn't acting out of charity here. They aren't subsidizing solar panels to save the Pakistani middle class. They have their own aggressive strategic goals, and they want leverage.
Exactly. And in just the past year, we have seen China show a very real, very aggressive willingness to weaponize their control over these exact supply chains. We've seen it specifically with their absolute dominance in the mining and refining of rare earth elements and the production of high-performance magnets.
Break that down for us. How does weaponizing rare earths actually impact the green grid of a developing nation? I mean, if I already have the solar panel on my roof, China can't turn off the sun.
True, they can't turn off the sun. But remember those cheap Nepalese electric vehicles?
Yeah.
The motors in those cars require permanent magnets made from rare earth elements like neodymium. The massive generators inside wind turbines require tons of those same magnets.
Yeah.
Battery storage systems require specialized minerals that China processes.
No, it's
So if a developing nation suddenly crosses Beijing politically, maybe they vote the wrong way at the UN or they dispute a territorial claim, China can instantly embargo the export of those critical components.
wow.
Suddenly, the motors for your EVs stop arriving. The replacement parts for your grid stop shipping. That's the hidden hook inside this cheap tech. They can and will use that leverage to paralyze an economy if it suits their national interest. So the dependence on China is still highly dangerous.
That makes total sense, but it still leaves a huge gap in the immediate reality, right? When you are a developing nation staring down an immediate existential crisis today, when you need to power your hospitals and keep food from rotting in refrigerators this afternoon, you simply do not have the luxury of worrying about what China might do with rare earth exports 5 years from now.
Exactly. You just don't.
You have to keep the lights on today, and right now the contrast between the two superpowers is just glaring.
It is an unavoidable reality. The war in the Middle East has become a real-time global stress test of two competing systems of reliance, and the results on the ground are undeniable.
It really is a profound realization. I mean, we spend so much of our time on this show analyzing formal treaties and the positioning of military bases and the outcomes of high-level diplomatic summits. But this deep dive really shows that in April 2026, the ultimate geopolitical shield for a developing nation isn't a piece of paper signed in Washington, D.C.
Nope.
It isn't a mutual defense pact with a nuclear superpower. It is literally millions of cheap, imported solar panels sitting on residential roofs in Karachi and affordable electric vehicles driving down the streets of Kathmandu.
It is the democratization of energy resilience.
Mhm.
And the great irony is it is brought to you by the aggressive overproduction of a centralized authoritarian state.
It's fascinating, and it brings us right back to where we started at the top of the show. That expectation of precision, of old economic models confidently predicting how the world works. The old model said you need American aircraft carriers to secure the flow of oil so your economy doesn't collapse.
Right.
The new reality says you just need enough cheap technology to unplug from the superpower game entirely. So, as you look around at your own reliance on global technology and the massive interconnected grid you depend on every single day, ask yourself a question. When the next major unpredictable crisis hits, is true security found in the ideology of who you align with politically? Or is it simply found in who builds the cheapest off grid technology? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.